Hey y'all, welcome back to Sewing with Sin. I have not shared any new tutorials or sew-alongs in a good while, and I am currently on summer break. I'm a teacher. A lot of you already know that. And I've actually been working on a couple of new patterns and challenging myself to try some new things. And so I thought this pattern that I'm currently working on, I wanted to do a sew-along because I was looking through the instructions and there were a few things that looked a little tricky and were a little difficult to understand as far as just looking at the illustrations and the directions. So I thought, I'm just gonna make a video and see how it goes. So the dress that I'm gonna be sharing with you and sewing with you today is Sew Liberated's, let's see, how do you say this? Petrichor Pinafore dress. I've never heard anyone say the word out loud, so I don't know. Petrichor? How would you say that? Anyway, this is what it looks like. This is the dress that I ended up making. It has a V-shaped yoke in the front. And then it has very low arm cycle right here on the sides. And then the straps, and this is what the back looks like. It has another yoke facing in the back as well. So, and then the back panel, it's actually, you can't see it very much, but it's actually two panels that you're gonna sew together right here in the middle. So there were a few little things that were slightly tricky for me, and you'll see as you go through this. But I wanted to share up front some things that are not going to be in the sew-along, because when I started videotaping, I realized, oops, there were a few steps that I didn't show. So let me look through the instructions and share with you what you need to do before we start sewing this dress. All right, so I'm looking at the instructions right now, and the steps that I am not showing here that I had prepped beforehand, obviously you need to cut all your fabric. I did not show stay stitching, so that's the first step that you want to make sure that you do. And then I also did not show the interfacing, so you're going to need to iron on your interfacing on the yoke pieces and on the pocket pieces. All of those directions are in the very first step. I'm looking at that right now. I only have the digital version on my laptop right here, so I don't have the printout of it, in case you're wondering what I'm looking at. And then the straps, sewing and preparing the straps, I also did not show that step, but that I think is pretty self-explanatory. So I hope that you're able to figure that part on your own. And then in just a minute, you're gonna see me start sewing the arm edges. But before that, I also wanted to share the fitting issues that I had. So if you're planning on sewing this and you haven't sewn it yet, this might not be an issue for you, but it was an issue for me and a friend of mine who also sewed this dress. I sewed it, hold on, I gotta check my measurements to see what size I was supposed to be. All right, I got my pattern pieces right here, and I ended up cutting a size 14. So when I'm looking at the chart right here, size 14 for me was almost exactly aligned with my bust, my waist, and my hips. So that's why I ended up cutting a size 14, because my measurements were right within that range. And also, I was lazy and I did not do a toile, so I wasn't sure how this was going to fit until I wore it, and I was just okay with that. So I would suggest, if you can, and if you have, I don't know, like a thrifted sheet or really cheap fabric that you don't care that much about, to do that first before you make anything that you haven't made before, especially if it's a new pattern maker, you just don't really know how it's going to fit you. And so the issues that I had, and I had to make adjustments after I made the entire garment, was shoulder straps, first of all, were way too long for me. And maybe it's because I'm really short, I'm only 5'1", and as I was fitting, you'll see me do this as well in the sew along, but as I was trying on the dress midway through, I already realized that the straps were going to be too long. So I took away, I think it was 2 inches off the straps. And then after I completely finished the garment and I tried it on, it was still sagging way too low. And so you'll see what I had to do here is I ended up cutting the strap right down the middle, and I really did not want to do that, but I just wanted it to be wearable. So I cut it, I split it, and then I chopped off another 2 inches. So in total, I think from the straps, I had to take out about 5 inches. They're so good about posting blog posts too, so you might want to go on their website and check out any blogs that they might have posted about this garment, because I'm pretty sure they had one for strap adjustments and other adjustments for this dress. Okay, and then the other problem is this arm cycle part right here. This for the size 14, it went out so wide for me that when I was standing up, this waist part right here, you can completely see all the way down my dress. Like if someone was walking by, they would be able to look inside my dress. And it was so wide, like flaring out too much for me. So what I ended up doing after the dress was already made is this whole side seam, I just flipped it inside out. And I'm just sharing this too in case you end up having this problem. It's resolvable. Like it's not like, oh, this garment doesn't fit me, I can't wear it. That's the great thing about being a sewist, is you can make your own alterations after you've already made the dress. So what I ended up doing is I had to take in, this is the side seam right here. I just pinched it with my finger when I was trying it on, and I took out about 1 inch or 5/8 of an inch. And then the tricky thing though about bringing in the side seam is there's a pocket right here and you can't close the pocket, obviously. So I brought it in as much as I could right here at the top of the side seam. And then I just graded it back out down here. So that way I still had my pocket. So I just wanted to share that up front, that when I make this dress again, which I will because I love it so much, I'll probably go down to a size 10. That's 2 sizes smaller than what I did. And I think that's all the notes I have before we get started.
All right, so you should have already cut your 4 arm facing pieces on the bias of your fabric. And I'm going to start with the front bodice first, and I'm going to match up this facing piece with right sides facing, so right side to right side, and you'll see that it's already folded in half, that facing piece. And that is the wrong side that's facing out right now, and you're just going to pin it in place along the entire arm cycle on the right side and on the left side. Now we're going to stitch that facing onto the arm cycle at a 3/8 inch or 1 centimeter seam allowance. Now we're going to trim that excess seam allowance off, and then we're going to clip the curved edges. So let's trim the seam allowances first, and it says to trim in half, so I'm cutting about half. And then make sure to clip the curved side so everything lays flat. Then you're going to get your iron and press all those seam allowances towards the facing. And here's what it looks like when it's fully pressed towards the facing. And now we're going to stitch that extra seam allowance in place. And now I'm on the wrong side of the garment. This is the facing where you're going to fold it over one time and fold it over again, and then I'm going to edge stitch that facing in place. That is step E. Let's see, this is Step 3, letter E. And I found that their directions weren't clear enough. It says in their directions, press the arm facing to the wrong side of the front and edge stitch it in place. But for me, if I were to just press it in place and not fold it over 2 times, it would have a raw edge. And you don't want a raw edge, obviously, because it's going to fall apart later on. So here you're seeing me just folding it over 1 time and folding it over again, and then enclosing that facing to the wrong side of the garment. Also, I should add that you can do the folding and press it and pin it in place before putting it under the machine like this. I'm just getting a little lazy with pinning things in place lately, and you'll see me just doing it right here on the machine. But if you're newer to sewing, I would recommend pinning all of this facing in place and then taking it over to the machine and edge stitching it. And here's what the facing should look like on the wrong side, and that's the right side of the bodice. And make sure to repeat that for the other side and the back bodice as well. All right, now here's the front dress. This is the right side of the front, and with the right side facing up, you're going to add that pocket and make sure that the inner facing is facing up, so the right side of the pocket is facing the right side of the dress. And I'm just marking, matching where the notches are at. There are notches for the pocket placement, so make sure that when you're cutting your fabric, you always mark your notches so you make sure that everything gets placed in the correct spot. Now you're going to sew that pocket in place at a 3/8 inch or 1 centimeter seam allowance. And here's what it should look like when you've sewn that 3/8 inch seam allowance. And then you're going to get your scissors and clip into the curved parts of the pocket once again. Then you'll press those seams out towards the pocket, and we're going to get ready to stitch that seam allowance in place. So you're going to edge stitch it close to that seam allowance once again, and this is what it will look like after you've stitched that in place. And then you're going to fold it to the wrong side of your dress and give it a really good press. Okay, so then you're going to lay your dress with the wrong side facing up right now and get your pocket facing, and you're going to place the right side of your pocket to the right side of the pocket that's already attached to the dress right now. And make sure that you mark all of those notches that are on the pocket facing and align it with that curved pocket that you've already sewn in place. So I'm just double checking, making sure everything is aligned, and then I'm going to pin the 2 pockets together and make sure that you don't accidentally pin it to the dress, not yet. Now let's take it over the machine, and you'll stitch the 2 pockets together. So make sure to move the dress out of the way, and you're going to stitch them together at a 3/8 inch seam allowance. So here I am just kind of maneuvering the dress so it's out of the way. You don't want to accidentally sew it onto the dress. And then stitch all the way around at 3/8 inch or 1 centimeter seam allowance. And then after you're done with this, you're going to use an overlock machine or a zigzag stitch to close up those seams from the pockets. Here's what the pocket should look like when it's all finished. And now we're going to get ready to attach that to the dress. That way it's not wiggling all around. So it says you're going to make sure that everything is laid really flat against the dress. I'm currently on step F right now. I don't even know what number. Oh, that's 4F that I'm on right now. And then I'm going to just pin it in place. I'm on the back side of the dress. pinning the pocket all the way around because then we're going to sew it onto the dress next. And when you're stitching it onto the dress, it says to just use the current stitch line that you already have. And that's what I did. I just stitched it on the seam allowance that was already there. And here's what it looks like from the front side, and that's what it looks like from the back. Then we're going to baste the top edge and the bottom edge of the pocket in place onto the dress. Now with the dress wrong side facing up, I'm going to mark 5/8 seam allowance from that center front, and I just use tailor's chalk right there, and then we're going to sew at a diagonal 5/8 seam allowance about an inch or so along the raw edge of the top. And then this is what that should look like. When you're finished with one side, flip it over, and now you're going to do the same on the opposite side. So I'm sewing again at 5/8 seam allowance, giving myself, I did about an inch and a half or so, and then you stop right at that center front. Now, in order to get ready for the gathers, right here where the notch is at, we're going to be sewing some basting stitches at, let's see, I think it's 3/8 of an inch and then 3/4 of an inch. So you're basting along either side of that stitch line that you just made right now. So you're going to pull your long threads and then make sure that your machine is set to a really wide stitch for basting stitches. And I'm going to start right here at the notch. And I'm first going to sew at 3/8 of an inch. So that's going to be really close to the edge of your fabric. And you're going to baste it all the way to that center mark that you had. And then pivot slightly and continue for that V shape all the way up to the next notch on the opposite side. And then you're going to repeat that process. Make sure to pull the long threads because you're going to gather that next. And then you're going to add basting stitches below that first original stitch that you made. So now we're sewing at a 3/4 inch seam allowance, adding basting stitches there. All right, now we're on step 5C, and we're going to mark the seam allowance of the outer front yoke. So that is the yoke that does not have interfacing to it. And I'm marking it at that bottom edge, 5/8 seam allowance, all the way across and on the opposite side as well. And again, I'm doing this on the wrong side of the fabric. Now we're going to grab that front dress, and this is the right side facing up right now, and we're going to attach the yoke with the right side to the right side of the dress. So right now I have the wrong side facing up, the right side is facing down, and that center V you're going to pin right at that center line that you had drafted earlier where your gathering stitches were at. And then I'm marking the notch and placing that notch to the notch of the dress. Pin that in place. And then you're going to find those basting stitches and pull really gently on them as you start to gather the dress so it matches the yoke. So here I am, I'm just gathering very gently, and that way it lays flat with the yoke piece. And then once you're finished gathering, you'll pin that in place, and you're gonna notice that the yolk hangs off the dress about 5/8 of an inch. That's how it should be, so you didn't do anything wrong. And then you're gonna do the same thing to the opposite, pin at the notch and pull those threads, gather the dress, and pin everything in place. And here's what it looks like from the wrong side of the dress. I'm just adding a few extra pins, making sure that everything is in place. Again, the yoke should be hanging off about 5/8 of an inch. And then we're going to be stitching this yoke in place at a 5/8 inch seam allowance. So I'm going to sew down to the center and then pivot slightly. So you're sewing, it's like at a diagonal, so really at like a V shape. So you'll be starting right there at the edge of the arm facing, and I'm sewing down 5/8 seam allowance all the way, removing pins along the way, right to that center marking that we had earlier. You might have to like peek under to find that marking where it was at. And then you're going to slightly pivot right at that center mark, and then continue sewing at 5/8 seam allowance. And here's what the back, the wrong side looks like, I should say. And then when you flip it out, oh, look how beautiful it is. This is what the front panel will look like. You're gonna see some extra basting stitches, so you can pull those out. And then you're gonna grab your shears and trim your seam allowance by about, I think it said about half in the instructions. So I'm just trimming that down. And then you'll just take a quick minute to remove those basting stitches so we can prepare for the next step. All right, we're moving on to the two back pieces now, and I wanted to mention that something important that you need to make sure that you do is mark, there's a dot right at the top of the center seam, and it's in the pattern piece, so make sure that you mark that before you do this, because when you put your center seams together, you're not going to sew above that dot. Then the directions, this is on 6A. It says you're going to place your right sides together, pin along the center seam, and sew that at a 5/8 inch seam allowance. And then it says to finish the seam allowances separately and press it open. You can see here that I already finished my seam allowances. So I used my serger, I finished each side, and then I'm doing this pinning and sewing down the center seam. I just find that that's easier to do first, because if you were to sew this and then try to serge it separately, it's a little tricky. And then after you've sewn that center seam down, this is what it will look like. I did not sew above that dot, so it should be split open at the top right there. Now, with the right side facing you right now, you're going to take that outer notch and fold it over to the center notch to make a little pleat, and then pin that in place. And then take the other outer notch on the opposite side, fold it again into that center notch, and pin that in place, and you should see a nice little V-shaped pleat on the outside of your garment. This is what it looks like from the wrong side. And then from the right side, you're gonna baste each little pleat in place. So that's what that looks like once it's basted. Okay, I have to apologize, I did not show what I did to the yoke here, but basically you do what you did to the front yoke piece. You mark that bottom edge at 5/8 seam allowance with a marking tool, and then you're going to pin it in place to the dress. And where that 5/8 inch seam allowance marking is, you're going to pin it right in place where that dot is. So remember that little dot that we did not sew above? That's where we're going to be marking that. So I'm just making sure to be careful that I'm pinning it right in that place. And that's going to be right where the center seam is going to be when you're sewing this yoke in place. Then you're going to stitch that again at a 5/8 inch seam allowance. And remember, it's going to be hanging off at the edges just like it was with the front dress yoke. And you're going to start at the arm binding. And again, you're going to sew kind of at a diagonal V. So I'm just lining up at 5/8 inch seam allowance and carefully sewing. I'm sewing kind of slow right here, and then removing pins and making sure that when you get to that center dot, that's that little split open part right there, you're going to pivot your dress slightly and then continue sewing all the way to the opposite arm facing. And here's what that looks like from the wrong side, and this is what it looks like from the right side of the dress. Ooh, so pretty. Okay, moving on. Now we'll add the straps on with right sides facing to the right side of the dress, and make sure that the straps are angled in at the bottom, and where you pin them at the top, you're going to pin them where the notches are at. Then we're going to take that inner front yoke, the one with the inner facing, and you're going to fold in those bottom edges by 1/2 inch seam allowance, just like you see here. And then you're going to pin it right sides facing. So I'm just pinning it right along the other yoke that's on the opposite side and making sure that the straps are sandwiched in between. Then you'll sew straight across that yoke at a 5/8 inch seam allowance, and we're going to trim that seam allowance before we flip it over. Now the directions clearly state, but I didn't read these directions clearly, that when you're trimming the seam allowance, you're only supposed to trim the inner faced yoke. Here you see me trimming both of them. So make sure to only trim the inner yoke with the interfacing. All right, we're on step 7D, and you're going to pin those straps out of the way and fold the yoke with the right sides facing. So we're going to get ready to enclose that yoke right there. And you're going to pin the side seams. Making sure that everything lines up on the raw edges. And then you're going to pin again the opposite side seams. Then we're going to get ready to stitch along that short edge right there, making sure that it lines up with the arm facing right there. So I'm starting at 5/8 seam allowance and carefully going down because you're trying to line it up with that arm facing right there. So my stitches on the yoke are going to go right over the stitches of the arm facing right there, just a tiny bit back stitch, and that's what that should look like right there. And then I'm going to do the same for the opposite side. So here's what it looks like when it's all stitched and finished along that side seam. And then we're going to get ready to pull it out, and I just wanted to show you what that should look like. And here I'm at step 7D and E, where you're folding in the yoke before you flip it right side out. And again, I did not trim my seam allowances correctly here, so I'm having some difficulty folding it. But if you only trim the seam allowances of the yoke with the interfacing, you should be good with this step. I had like a little extra bulk because I did not follow all the instructions. Now you're also seeing the problem that I encountered when I pulled out the straps. Everything's not laying flat like it should, excuse me. Um, and I was just trying to figure out what did I do wrong. I think I might have sewn the seam allowances a little off from 5/8 inch. Um, and then you see the opposite strap. And here it looks like everything is laying flat. So I just want you to see the difference between the two and the struggle that I kind of encountered with this right strap over here. It's like bubbling out a little bit. The other one looks great. So what I'm trying to do is snip into my seam allowance that I just sewed to figure out like where's that bulk coming from. And you might have to do something like that too. You might have to undo some stitches and restitch it right there to make sure that the straps are laying flat. I can't figure out what exactly it was that I did, but as you see, I'm trimming some of that seam that I had sewn, and once I did that, then it starts to lay flat, and then I just kind of restitched it a little bit. And of course, you're going to press it with an iron too. So this is what it looks like now after I pressed it, after I restitched that area right there, and everything looks good. It looks flat, and I'm ready to move on to this next step. Okay, now we're going to close up those two yolks, the inner and outer facings. And there's two ways that you can do this. I'm going to show you the first way. You can pin the yoke in place, and you're going to be stitching in the ditch. So you want to make sure that that inner yoke, the one on the inside of the dress, is pinned right through that seam in the front, just right there. And then you would just continue pinning the yoke, covering that seam right there, and making sure that you're pinning it through the seam on the front side of the dress. Now, my preferred method is to use this double-sided basting tape to pin it right along that seam. I'm sorry, not pin it, to tape it right along the seam right there. And I'm just pushing it down on the fabric of the dress and slowly pulling out the tape in place of pinning. This is what I prefer doing instead. I just have a lot of issues stitching in the ditch, and I feel like I have more accuracy when I'm using this tape. So you just push it down really hard, and then you peel off the tape, and then you cover up the tape with the yoke right there. So it's just an alternative to pinning in place. And then I usually add one little pin at least at each end before I get started sewing. So you have a couple of different ways that you can do that. You can also top stitch, but I'm going to be stitching in the ditch right here. So you're going to want to sew right in that seam right there. That way you're catching the yoke on the other side to enclose it. So this step you want to go really slow. That way your inner yoke also looks beautiful from the inside, not just the outside. And I should clarify too, if you were using pins and not the double-sided tape that I was doing, you would slowly be removing the pins, making sure that the yoke doesn't wiggle around as you're removing the pins, and then continue stitching in the ditch all the way across that yoke. And here's what the back side should look like when you're finished. Now we're at step 8, and we're about to attach the straps to the back of the dress. And I'm just checking to make sure. Remember how I mentioned at the beginning that I had a feeling these straps were going to be too long for me. So you might want to just try it on at this point like I'm doing and check to see, are the straps hanging too low for you? And if they are, this is a good time to make that adjustment. Because I had to make, like I said earlier in the video, I had to make some adjustments even after this. It was still too long for me. So here you just see me kind of making a few little adjustments to the strap. I just kind of pinned it to see where I did want it in place, and then here you see me marking that spot. This is about how many inches I took off initially. Unfortunately, after I finished the dress, I still had to take off more length. But here I took off about 2 inches off of each strap. So I just wanted to show how I'm doing that, because you might not know that you need to take off that length until you try it on. So I'm just measuring it out, and then I'm going to trim off that excess off the strap, but make sure that you still keep that angle. And here are my straps after I trimmed them, and then I also remarked the notch, that way I have that. And then we're going to get ready to enclose them into the back of the dress. So you're going to match the notch from the tie to the notch on that back yoke and pin that in place. So make sure that you're putting right sides facing right side of the tie to right side of that yoke, and then repeat for the other side. And then you're going to baste those two straps in place at a 1/2 inch seam allowance. And you'll see I'm just checking those side yokes to make sure that there's a hangover of 5/8 inches, and then you're ready to sew that. Okay, now we're adding on that yoke, and you're going to pin it with right sides facing, and you're going to stitch along that top edge at 5/8 inch seam allowance. And after you've done that, then you're going to grade your seams, but only, again, I did not make the same mistake that I made earlier. So now you see me only trimming the interfaced yoke. Leave the other yoke untrimmed. And then I'm even trimming some of the strap right there as well. And then you're going to move those straps out of the way, just like you did with the front of the dress. You have to pin them out of the way because we're going to be closing that yoke on the side seams and sewing along those side seams, just like we did with the front. So this is the exact same step, but now you're doing it with the back. So I am on step 8D right now, matching up those side seams of the yoke and pinning them in place, again, just like we did with the front. So this should feel very familiar because you already did this step. And you're sewing out a 5/8 inch seam allowance and making sure that the stitching of your yoke aligns with the stitching of that facing of your side seam right there. And so this is what it should look like, and repeat for the other side. Now grade those seam allowances, but only from the inner yoke, the yoke with the inner facing on it. Now you're going to fold in the corners of that seam allowance and hold it firmly in place. This was a little tricky to do. And then you're going to flip it right side facing out. And then for the sake of time, I'm not going to show this step all over again, but basically you're going to be enclosing this yoke once again. You can use the tape that I used or pin it in place and then stitch in the ditch from the front of the dress. Ooh, y'all, we're so close to being finished now. These steps are a lot easier. You're going to align the side seams with right sides facing, pin all of your side seams in place, and then you're going to straight stitch all the way down that side seam at a 5/8 inch seam allowance. And here is what it should look like on the inside. And this is the point where I realized 5/8 inch seam allowance was still too wide for me. So you can see that I went back right there at the top and I brought in the seam allowance by, I think it was about 1/2 inch or maybe 3/8 of an inch. And then I graded it back out. That way I didn't enclose that pocket seam right there. And then you're going to enclose your side seams with a serger or a zigzag stitch. And you're going to add a bar tack right there where the arm facings meet. That way your dress doesn't, it stays put and it's faced towards the back of the dress. So that's what that bar tack does. It kind of holds everything in place right there. And I'm not showing this step, but obviously you'll repeat all of this for the opposite side seam. And then the last step I'm also not showing. You're just going to hem the bottom of your dress and then you're all finished. And here's what the dress looks like out in the wild. Thanks for watching. Don't forget to like this video if you found it helpful and subscribe.